It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. Germany is on the verge of finalizing its exit from coal as a source of energy by the year 2038. Late last month, the cabinet of Chancellor Angela Merkel decided to provide 40 billion euros to the regions in Germany that would be affected by the shutting down of all of Germany's coal power plants and coal mines. Earlier this year, in January, a special governmental commission for planning Germany's exit from coal by the year 2038 provided a plan for how Germany could organize such a transition. Here's what one of the commission's members, Barbara Pretorius, had to say about the commission's proposal.
The train of climate protection in Germany is speeding up again. We started the project with the clear knowledge that without reducing coal-fired power generation, it would not be possible to achieve the climate protection goals in Germany. And I am therefore very glad that we are presenting a roadmap today that makes this achievable.
Environmental groups in Germany have welcomed the government's decision to exit from coal and to provide 40 billion euros in transition funds. But they point out that the transition away from coal is not happening as fast as it needs to were Germany to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement. According to them, the exit from coal would have to be completed by 2030. Joining me now to discuss Germany's exit from coal is Bob Pollin. Bob is Distinguished Professor of Economics and Co-Director of the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His most recent book is Greening the Global Economy. Thanks for joining us today, Bob.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So before we start, I should note that the plan for Germany's exit from coal is not finalized. It's expected that the law for the exit will pass Germany's parliament later this month. But the rough outline is in place, a phase out by 2038 and a transition fund of 40 billion euros to help improve infrastructure and provide jobs for the 20,000 workers who are employed in the coal sector. What do you make of this plan, Germany's plan to exit from coal as a source of energy?
Well, in general, it is a very favorable development because Germany and everybody else absolutely must exit from coal. And right now, Germany depends heavily on coal, supplying about a quarter of all of its energy needs. So for Germany to move off of coal is a major transition. And the fact that they are committing to it is critical. And now we have to make sure that they follow through and they do it. In terms of the transition process and providing support for workers and communities that will be affected, that's also critical. And the fact that they are leading with that, with a transition plan for the regions, affected regions, and the workers, is something that the U.S. needs to adopt and every other country that depends heavily on coal needs to adopt. The amounts that are needed to support the workers are actually pretty small. And the fact that Germany is saying 40 billion for the communities and the workers, I actually think is a reasonable number. We're looking at 20,000 workers, more or less. And if we're saying a transition over 20 years, that's roughly 1,000 workers per year getting displaced. That's less than 1/100th of 1% of the German labor force. We can easily provide new jobs for these workers, wage insurance, pension protections, and that's what the German plan seems to be aiming towards. In addition, it does have a plan for the regions. The one thing in my reading that they have not focused on, which they need to focus on in terms of regional transition, is very simple: land reclamation, reusing, cleaning up the land, getting rid of the coal ash, and repurposing the land will itself be a source of job creation and a revitalization of the regions.
Well, the point that you raise about the land, I think, is very interesting, considering that Germany's coal mines are actually, to a large extent, strip mines, which have been extremely devastating. They've actually even had to move entire towns in order to make room for these strip mines. But one of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, that the environmental groups, particularly the BUND, which is the German affiliate of Friends of the Earth, has mentioned, is that they say that the coal exit is good, but not fast enough. According to them, it should happen by 2030, not 2038. What do you make of this criticism?
I'm not an expert on the details of the German situation, but my understanding of based on the latest IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report of October 2018, what they're saying is that not just Germany, but the world has to cut emissions by 50% roughly as of 2030 and be at net zero emissions by 2050. And those are the goals. Those are the things that absolutely need to be achieved. And within that framework, it's, again, I'm not absolutely certain on the details of the German case, whether we get to zero coal by 2030 or 2038, to me seems secondary to meeting these overall goals. So if we get to zero coal by 2038 and get to net zero all emissions by 2050 in Germany, and if Germany helps subsidize these kinds of transitions in other regions of the world as well, that to me seems the most crucial goal to hit.
Now, there's a recent study by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Science that found that the government's plan could have unforeseen consequences that would actually counteract the emissions goals on a Europe-wide level. That is, since Germany exports a large part of its coal power, this could actually raise power prices in the rest of Europe. Not within Germany, ironically enough, because they would have a transition to renewable energy that's on par in terms of the expense. But in the rest of Germany, there'd be less energy, rest of Europe, there'd be less energy, therefore prices would go up, and that would provide an incentive to produce more, and particularly produce more polluting power outside of Germany. Now, what do you make of this warning, and how could that be dealt with?
Well, I think that is a very serious concern, and that's exactly why I raised the point that we can't think of these transitions on a nation-by-nation basis only. It's obviously a global transition. And so that the rest of Europe also needs to undergo a transition and also needs to get off coal, 100% off of coal. Now, if we look at the data on relative prices of renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, some hydro, relative to coal and other fossil fuels, on average, the renewable sources are at cost parity. That is, they do not cost any more to buy a kilowatt of electricity from wind power. It actually costs less than coal. On top of that, as part of the energy transition, we need to invest in raising energy efficiency standards. Again, not just in Germany, but everywhere. So if Germany helps support the transition throughout Europe and throughout the world, through investments in renewable energy to build capacity and to raise efficiency standards, it won't hurt these economies at all in terms of what happens with respect to the coal price, because they're transitioning to low-cost renewables and high efficiency. So that at the level of consumption, of individual consumption by businesses, households, they will not see energy prices go up as long as we have a good investment program to transition to renewables and efficiency.
Now, the other warning that the Potsdam Institute made is that on an EU-wide level, there are carbon dioxide trading certificates, which would become cheaper with Germany's exit from coal and its reduction in CO2 emissions. Now, how could this be avoided as a problem on an EU level?
Yeah. So again, the issue of trading certificates, to me, is just going to have to become secondary. We're not really that interested whether or not you have trading certificates. What we need to do is just cut consumption of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. And we must have ironclad commitments to reach zero emissions by 2050. What happens in the interstices within that project is of secondary importance. So, for example, if we say we need to build up renewable energy supply dramatically, I've costed this out for the US, for Germany, in fact, for other economies, for a global economy. We're looking at something in the range of investments in the range of 2.5% of global GDP per year in these new investment areas, renewables, efficiency, and also improving the transmission and storage technology. And then everything else doesn't really matter very much. And the trading systems have been useful in places, but generally they have been used as the way you're describing, as means through which we can avoid reaching the hard requirements of emission reduction. And that's simply unacceptable moving forward.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Bob Pollin, Distinguished Professor of Economics and Co-Director at the Political Economy Research Institute at the UMass Amherst. Thanks again, Bob, for having joined us today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.